Start in northwest England. A little cloud will bubble up this afternoon, perhaps with 1 or 2 showers. However, most places should stay dry and warm. A bright and warm day in the northeast too, with some sunny spells. It could be cloudier at times along the coast of Northumberland. There'll be a touch of sunshine in eastern Scotland, where it'll feel pleasantly warm, but skies will be cloudier in the west. The cloud could bring a few spots of drizzle at times. Thicker cloud in Northern Ireland will bring some heavy showers this afternoon. The heavy downpours could bring hail and a few rumbles of thunder too. Showers will gradually ease this evening, leaving a dry end to the day for most and a mild evening too. And that is how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing, your afternoon fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis. I'm Arlene Foster, and here's what's coming up over the next hour. The Prime Minister has faced backlash from human rights groups on his proposals to fly Channel migrants to Rwanda. We will be discussing whether the Prime Minister's plans are sensible or just a manoeuvre to boost his poll ratings post-Partygate. Corrie legend Charlie Lawson will join us to discuss how he is helping veterans in Northern Ireland. And we speak to a military expert on the possibility of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. And we will be discussing the Russian warship that was confirmed to have sunk yesterday. So give me your political briefing. Send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews.
Good afternoon. It's just past 3 o'clock. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. Ukraine says street battles are ongoing in the besieged city of Mariupol as several powerful explosions hit the capital Kiev and its surrounding areas overnight. Russia says it's increasing its missile strikes after the sinking of one of its warships. Ukrainian forces claim the Moskva sank after they hit it with missiles on Wednesday. The Kremlin insists it went down after an explosion on board. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the loss of the vessel in the Black Sea is a blow to Moscow's military capabilities.
It's a big blow to Russia. This is their flagship, the Moscow, and they have now been forced to admit that it has been badly damaged. And they've had to kind of choose between 2 stories. One story is that it was just incompetence, and the other was that they came under attack, and neither is a particularly good outcome for them.
Downing Street says asylum seekers who've arrived in the UK illegally could be sent to Rwanda within 6 weeks. The government is planning to fly people to the East African country to have their asylum claims processed there. The Prime Minister says the £120 million deal will serve as a considerable deterrent to migrants attempting to cross the Channel. The chair of Migration Watch, Alf Mehmet, told GBNews the measure will stop some people risking their lives.
Not suddenly going to stop all the boats coming across. Of course it's not. It's part of the solution, though. Is it more humane to allow people to risk their lives in dinghies, in really unseaworthy vessels? That's a nonsense. It isn't inhumane. I think this is actually a kind thing to be doing.
Well, UK immigration lawyer Harjap Singh Bangal said the scheme is similar to the one adopted by Australia and says it's unworkable and too expensive.
Last year, Australia processed 249 people offshore. It cost them £461 million, so UK pounds. If we're thinking, and the expectations are now, in the eyes of the British public, oh, this is great, there's going to be 20,000 people sent to Rwanda, their figures just don't make sense at all. £120 million isn't going to cut it.
Hundreds of Palestinians have been detained after clashes with Israeli police at one of Jerusalem's holiest sites. Officers tried to disperse a large crowd of people at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, also known as Temple Mount. Israeli authorities say groups were throwing rocks at the compound after morning prayer. Emergency services say at least 150 people have been injured. The clashes come as Christians, Jews and Muslims prepare to celebrate Easter, Passover and Ramadan. Residents in Shanghai have clashed with police over new coronavirus policies. It's being reported residents have protested after being told to immediately leave their apartment building so the government can use it as a COVID isolation facility. Footage shows people kneeling and even lying down in front of police wearing hazmat suits, with some being dragged away. Latest figures show there are 23,000 infections in Shanghai. Dozens of climate change protesters have been charged after 3 oil terminals were blocked today. Activists from Just Stop Oil blocked roads and climbed on oil tankers in Staffordshire and Essex. The group, who are linked to Extinction Rebellion, are demanding the government stops new oil and gas projects. One campaigner says the government isn't doing enough.
And obviously we don't do this lightly. We've tried everything else. We've literally done everything we possibly could to get this message across. And it's not a message, it's a cry for help. It's an emergency, and we need to be acting like it's an emergency. The UN says it's a code red for humanity, and the government are just failing.
England's Test cricket captain Joe Root says stepping down from the role is the most challenging decision of his career. Root holds the record for the highest number of Test match wins as captain since he took on the role in 2017. But he's chosen to leave after 2 series defeats against the West Indies last month and Australia in the winter. Vice-captain Ben Stokes has paid tribute, saying Root has been a privilege to work with. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens, of course. Now, though, it's back to the briefing with Arlene.
Welcome back to the briefing. Plans to send some asylum seekers who arrive in the UK on small boats to live in Rwanda have been described as absolutely chilling and cruel and nasty by charities and politicians. But Boris Johnson said the £120 million pilot scheme would save countless lives. The Prime Minister said it would break the business model of vile people smugglers. The pilot scheme would initially focus mainly on single men arriving on boats or lorries and would see them given a one-way ticket for the 4,000-mile trip to Rwanda, where they would be processed and, if successful, would have long-term accommodation in the African country. Well, joining me in the studio today and for the rest of the show, I'm very pleased to say, is author Angelica Mallon. Angelica, this is a hugely controversial proposal policy now of the government, and there's been quite a reaction to it. What is your take on it today?
Yeah, there has been quite the backlash with saying that it's inhumane. One thing I think that's interesting to note with this is I feel like after Partygate there needed to be a kind of big splash, something that could go on all the headlines and the front covers of papers, and that's very much worked in this case because it does feel like people are not talking about the birthday cake anymore and they're talking about this story. Not that this story isn't important, but I do think that's something to note. Could this be a kind of a political move here to distract from that story? We've seen in Australia that that they've tried similar schemes at a huge cost with not that much success. So it's interesting that this is something that the government is choosing to do. I think the scale of it perhaps has been overblown. We've heard from quite a lot of experts saying that it doesn't seem like it's going to be in the thousands of people that will be piloting in this scheme, and the numbers will probably be a lot longer. But the process isn't really changing. It's just outsourcing it to another place, which we've seen in other countries doesn't really work.
Well, that's a very interesting point you make, because we heard earlier on in the news that it was, in Australia they're talking about hundreds of people for a huge amount of money. But is that the case, that it's hundreds of people because it has acted as a deterrent, and actually there aren't as many people trying to get into Australia during that period of time? I think it was 2001 they started their offshore policy, and then they said they saw a drop in the number of people trying to get into Australia. And isn't this what the PM is trying to do? He's trying to deter people from making that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. It's trying to deter people from making that journey in the first place. Whether or not that will actually work, I'm not so sure that it actually will, and it's kind of it's increasing the danger involved with it. Actually, it's a really worrying thing overall. So I think there's two things I think need to happen. One is investing more in humanitarian and development aid to the countries that people are fleeing from in the first place, and then looking at the processes with the channel. So at the end of last year, 100,000 people were still waiting to hear about their asylum status, like 62,000 of which have been waiting for more than 6 months. So that process is also super slow. So looking at those two things as well.
And you're right to point out how slow the process is, because actually a couple of those who were in the process actually committed crimes here, some of them quite serious crimes, whilst they were in the process here. And I mean, that's why people are saying, OK, you don't like this proposal policy of sending people to Rwanda. What's your alternative? And what is Labour saying is the alternative?
Well, it's about process is the alternative, is how can we speed up the process of what's happening here in the UK and making things safer, and investing more development-wise in the countries that people are fleeing from to make them safer places as well.
Yeah, and you talked about investing in international development, and I thought it was interesting that Andrew Mitchell MP, who used to be the International Development Minister when we had an International Development Minister, said that the scheme was impractical, immoral and expensive, and that's somebody from the Tory backbench.
That is interesting. But there's also no guarantee when they get to Rwanda that they will be granted status there, and they may be returned to the country that they fled from as well.
Yeah, and having said that, they put up, and they wouldn't they, quite nice footage from the detention centres that have been proposed, and they are much nicer than some of the accommodation that immigrants would get if they landed here on a boat. Is that not the case?
And the UK government is saying that they're going to be investing a lot of money in building those that structure in Rwanda, so that they are sent to centres that are better. But I still think that it's a pretty controversial thing to be doing.
Oh, well, undoubtedly it's controversial, and we've talked about Australia, but I was reading up before the show that Denmark is also looking at working with Rwanda on detention centres, and of course Denmark is in the European Union, which I found very interesting as well. So this issue of immigrations, and particularly economic migrants, isn't going to go away, and I suppose the supporters of the Prime Minister would very much argue that something had to be done, because what we have at the moment are tens of thousands of people trying to come across the Channel, some of them dying in the process, so there had to be an intervention.
Well, this is very much to deter economic migrants, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course they've said it's going to be men mostly that, actually it's men that are going to be given the ticket to Rwanda, and not women and children. And does that not show that this has been quite a lot of thought has gone into this?
I don't know. I wouldn't be overplaying this as like highly compassionate. I don't, to me this doesn't seem like a compassionate immigration policy. This feels like outsourcing it as a problem rather than looking at how it can be addressed in the UK in a better kind of systematic way. And the other thing is saying that it's offering offering long-term placement in Rwanda. It's just 5 years is what they're offering if you're granted status there. I would argue 5 years is not actually that long, and that it will obviously deter people, but I think we need to be compassionate as well.
Yep, but looking at the compassionate piece, do we not also have to be compassionate for our own citizens as well? Because, of course, open borders is a policy that has been in for quite some time now. There has to be a way that we, not stopping immigration, but control those people who come to live here in the UK. And is this not the way to do that? To look at that in a compassionate way, to say we don't want to see more people dying coming across the channel. What we want to see is controlled migration.
Well, I think then the question is Rwanda a compassionate place to be sending people, and people wanting to come to the UK, obviously for particular economic opportunities. In Rwanda, what are their employment-wise opportunities? What does it look like when you are granted refugee status in Rwanda? And that is a piece to consider whether or not this is compassionate.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of those who are now questioning the status of Rwanda as a country to go and live in aren't talking about issues such as the human rights abuses of Qatar, where, of course, we have the World Cup coming up very soon. And I'm quite happy to go to the World Cup in Qatar and not talk about the human rights abuses there.
Yeah, it's true. There's so much that we turn a blind eye to when it comes to humanitarian. I know Twitter is something that we're talking about later, but Saudi Arabia being involved with Twitter, there are so many things where there's so many countries behind what's going on that have their own humanitarian questions to be considered.
Well, Angelica, stay with us because we're going to come back to some other issues, but now I'm going to move on to Jerusalem. And Israeli security forces have clashed with hundreds of stone-hurling Palestinians early this Easter Friday morning after they entered a Palestinian holy site after Ramadan prayers, leaving dozens injured. According to Israeli authorities, dozens of masked men marched into Al-Aqsa Mosque compound before dawn, carrying Palestinian and Hamas flags, chanting and setting off fireworks. Well, joining me now is journalist Jotam Confino from Tel Aviv. Jotam, thank you so much for joining me. And perhaps you could bring us up to date with what's going on in Jerusalem today.
Well, so a dangerous escalation in East Jerusalem this morning, as you mentioned, dozens, in fact, 150 Palestinians were injured on the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located, in clashes with Israeli security forces. It is very, very dangerous because the situation currently between the Palestinians and the Israelis is extremely tense. You can argue it's always tense, but in the past couple of weeks, it reached a new level. And this is due to a number of terrorist attacks committed by ISIS affiliates and Palestinians inside Israel. And of course, the retaliation coming from the Israeli side, which is night raids in the West Bank, mass arrests, and of course, a lot of casualties on the Palestinian side. So what we saw this morning was really just an escalation of the past couple of weeks, the tension. And we have to remember, it's Ramadan now, the high holiday for Muslims. It's also Pesach, the Jewish holiday, and it's also Easter, of course. So the religious element here only adds to the tension, which is why we saw these scenes this morning. And the videos circulating on social media just really fan the flames on both sides. Muslims are outraged that the Israeli security forces are entering the holy Muslim site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Jews and Israelis are outraged the Palestinians with Hamas flags are hurling stones and fireworks at worshippers just very close to the compound.
And Jotam, you mentioned there the geography of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall and how close they are in proximity to each other. And we saw some footage earlier on before you came on the show on our news footage. And what we seen there were some quite distressing scenes in Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I'm sure those are distressing for all the faithful, whether you're Jewish, Muslim or indeed Christian at this holy time. Will there be a stepping back from this after today's prayers and after this holy day, which of course is marked by all of the Abrahamic faiths?
Well, that is the big question. I think the majority of people here in Israel and the Palestinian territories are hoping for this to calm down. I don't think most people are interested in a war, but as we all know, it doesn't take many extreme people on each side to fan the flames to a point where you actually escalate to such a point that you're entering a war. If we just rewind exactly a year ago, we saw the exact same scenes on in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, hundreds of Palestinians injured daily. and it escalated with Hamas firing rockets from Gaza into Israel, actually over Jerusalem, because Hamas, as we have to remember, thinks that Israel is occupying all of the land, both Israel, the Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem. But the red line for Hamas is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they've said it repeatedly. So they already said today that Israel will bear the consequences of what happened today in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. To them, it is outrageous that Israelis are entering in such a way. So everyone here is really just waiting to see, to hear if we're going to hear rocket sirens as we're used to here in Israel, and if the retaliation from the Israeli side will be another Gaza war. It could be. Everyone here is really expecting some sort of escalation. Whether it will be a war or a more controlled escalation remains to be seen, of course.
Well, that's very concerning news, Jotam. You're in Tel Aviv today, and of course, this time last week I was speaking to one of your countrymen about the fact that there'd been that horrific attack in Tel Aviv last Thursday. Have things calmed in Tel Aviv since last Thursday's attack?
They've calmed because people are used to always being alert, so life goes on. But you see an unusual amount of policemen patrolling the streets pretty much all over Israel. There's a sense of heightened security, and especially in East Jerusalem, thousands of additional police forces have been deployed. And in the West Bank, of course, they're actually imposing a lockdown now for the next 48 hours because of the Jewish Passover, and because they want to prevent any terror attacks from happening in the coming 48 hours. So security forces are on maximum alert here, and people here are just, getting used to it. It's not the first time we've seen waves of terror attacks in Israel. It's been happening for decades, really.
Jotam, thank you very much for joining me and for updating our viewers and listeners this afternoon. Well, Angelica, unfortunately, it is something that we've come to expect in Jerusalem at this time of year, but it's still nonetheless very distressing to see those pictures, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very concerning to see. They often see heightened violence around Ramadan, and with it being Passover and Easter weekend, but it's very concerning. And also at a time when tourism was actually picking back up to the region, and lots of Jewish people from around the world will be travelling to Israel for Passover for the next 8 days. It's very sad to see.
It is indeed, and he was saying there he expected some sort of reaction to the fact that the security forces had got into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I understand that they went in after prayers, but I don't think that will have a big impact, because they're saying that has really breached their place, their holy place. So there will be a reaction, according to Jotam, and of course we hope that's not the case, but it may well be.
Yeah, well, it might be things like lockdowns extended to larger parts of Israel. We hope to see that it doesn't escalate.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Angelica. Coming up next, we're going to change tack and speak to Corrie legend Charlie Lawson on his campaign for Northern Ireland veterans. But before that, let's take a look at the all-important weather.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking dry for many, with some sunshine, but cloudier in the west. Let's take a look at the details. Skies are likely to be cloudy across parts of Devon and Cornwall this afternoon, with some drizzle and sea fog in the west. Further east, it'll be brighter with some warm, sunny spells. The brightness extends into southeast England, where there'll be plenty of sunny spells this afternoon, feeling warm in the sunshine with a high of 23 Celsius in London today. It's a cloudier picture for much of Wales, with some patchy drizzle over the hills. The sunshine could break through at times in the east, where it'll feel warm. After a bright start in northwest England, a little cloud will bubble up this afternoon, perhaps with 1 or 2 showers. However, most places should stay dry and warm. A bright and warm day in the northeast too, with some sunny spells. It could be cloudier at times along the coast of Northumberland. There'll be a touch of sunshine in eastern Scotland, where it'll feel pleasantly warm, but skies will be cloudier in the west. The cloud could bring a few spots of drizzle at times. Thicker cloud in Northern Ireland will bring some heavy showers this afternoon. The heavy downpours could bring hail and a few rumbles of thunder too. Showers will gradually ease this evening, leaving a dry end to the day for most, and a mild evening too. And that is how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
We've got a big Saturday for you on GB News. From 6 a.m, it's breakfast with Stephen and Anne. At 10, join Esther and Philip for the Saturday selection. Alistair, Darren and Nana take you through the day. And don't miss Neil Oliver Live at 7 p.m. At 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight, followed by Headliners. That's Saturday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Welcome back to the briefing. It's 3:25. So last year, two Northern Ireland veterans, Conor Ferguson and Ian Reid, walked 430 miles around Northern Ireland in 12 days. The purpose was to raise funds and awareness for veterans suffering from PTSD. And one of those supporting the venture was well-known actor Charlie Lawson. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that Charlie joins me now. Good to see you, Charlie.
And good to see you, Arlene, eh?
Yeah, good to see you.
Look at your new career, eh?
Well, listen, this time last year, we were getting ready for that wee dander round our wee, a big dander round our wee country. This year, the boys are doing something different. What are they up to this year?
Well, we thought, didn't we, Arlene? You and I looked at each other last year and we said 430 miles in sort of 12 days was completely barking. But of course, the boys did it with their support team, and we were able to receive a cheque when it was all finished for £22,000 over Dundela Football Club. God bless them, one afternoon. And of course, as Conor and Ian said when they were speaking along with Rab and Anne-Marie that evening over a few beers, they were already planning their new venture for this year, which of course is a big dander around the UK and Ireland, which this time is, I think, it's almost 600 miles, and they're planning to do that, and not 18 days, I believe, I think 17 and a half now. And I will go, a pair of us will go through the list of where they're going to be. So they're doing that all the way from, well, look, I'll do it now, Arlene, shall I? So
yes.
They'll start off at Stormont on the 26th of May, and they will walk from Stormont to the ferry at Larne, the ferry to Stranraer, Wigton, Dumfries, Dumfries to Carlisle, Carlisle, Whitehaven, Whitehaven to Milham, Milham, Levens, Levens to Lancaster, Lancaster to Blackpool, Blackpool to Southport, Southport to Liverpool, Liverpool to Chester, Chester to Abergelly, Abergelly to Holyhead, and they'll get on the wee boat across the Dublin ferry, and they'll get off there, and then they'll walk from Dublin to Drogheda. They'll cross the border over to Newry, back to Lisburn, and back to Stormont, by which stage I suspect they'll be mentally and utterly drained and physically completely knackered.
Yeah.
But everybody is welcome to join them on any of those legs. I'm sure you'll give the website out exactly, Arlene, but yeah, it's a tremendous challenge. And I'm deeply proud to be a supporter of Beyond the Battlefield.
Yeah, and Beyond the Battlefield provides very practical support, doesn't it, Charlie, to people who need a wee hand, as we would say in Northern Ireland, and who may be feeling down. They provide counselling, they provide very practical support. And you got involved because you felt passionately that veterans in Northern Ireland weren't getting all of the support that they needed and should have been receiving.
Well, I mean, that is fairly uncommon knowledge. If you say that to not so much veterans over here in England, but if you certainly talk to the general public, they kind of assume that there is a huge umbrella in which Northern Ireland veterans are included. Now, they are not excluded, but it is not made any easier by large charities for them to become embraced, if you like, because their circumstances are totally different. We are quite a quiet, and I know you've people listening from England, Scotland, Wales, and everywhere else around the planet will find this rather hard to believe, but we are quite a quiet people. We don't moan. Veterans still live in Northern Ireland. It is hard for them to find help. It's hard for them to get across the water to find help. And strangely, we seem to have been neglected. Now, there are exceptions to that. Of course there are. There are small charities. You know that Andy Allen runs one, etc. But Beyond the Battlefield came to my attention a couple of years ago. They've managed to secure some decent money for a site in Portavogie, which is currently being, it's standing, it's built, and it's now being refined and honed and made totally professional. And this, as opposed to various other sites in the United Kingdom, this is open to all who served in Northern Ireland, and indeed all who served. It's open to all veterans, and it also includes the emergency services, or the blue light guys and girls, as we call them. It's more than a respite centre. It's, Anne-Marie and Rab will be there flying the flag, but it'll be full of qualified people. It is a safe place for veterans to go. And Arlene, particularly ex-RUC men and ex-UDR live in communities where they need to keep their heads down and be quiet. Particularly the RUC, I think I've come across, as you will have done over the last couple of years. I know a very close friend of mine, Melanie Brown, lost her brother to severe PTSD and alcoholism, etc. With common problems. And there's very little help for these people because they tend to be very quiet. But they are there in our community, quietly trying to get on with their lives with massive strain on their shoulders. I tweeted yesterday, Arlene, that on ITV at 6 o'clock, they were saying it was the anniversary of that terrible, horrendous bombing in Manchester Arena at the Ariana Grande concert. And there was a lovely lady being interviewed, a paramedic, I believe, who turned up on that horrendous evening, and she suffers from PTSD. I merely put out on Twitter, I also sent her my best wishes, of course, and I just mentioned on Twitter that for decades, not only our emergency services, but all the services suffered horrendous sights, horrendous violence. The things we did to each other were indescribable. For decades, they put up with this. And they don't shout about it. They don't demand help. They don't make, although we do try to make documentaries and then COVID comes along, but they don't shout and yell and scream about it, and they don't make a big noise across in England, and they tend to be forgotten. Now, look, you and I are aware that this is not for everybody in our community, and we know that. We all suffered in different ways. But I'm here with Beyond the Battlefield for this particular part of the community. And, people may not like me for it, but I'm very proud of that.
Well, listen, Charlie, you and I could have a chat for the whole of the afternoon about this issue, because I know how passionate you feel about it. But thank you so much for coming on and for raising awareness of a big dander around the UK and Ireland. I'm sure the boys will be happy that you've given it a good plug. Thanks a million, Charlie. So coming up after the break, we will be talking to a military expert on the sinking of Russia's flagship military vessel and the consequences if Sweden or Finland join NATO. But first, here's the news headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 3:33. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. Ukraine says street battles are ongoing in the besieged city of Mariupol as several powerful explosions hit the capital, Kiev, and its surrounding areas overnight. Russia says it's increasing its missile strikes after the sinking of one of its warships. Ukrainian forces claim the Moskva sank after they hit it with missiles on Wednesday. The Kremlin insists it went down after an explosion on board. Hundreds of Palestinians have been detained after clashes with Israeli police at one of Jerusalem's holiest sites. Officers tried to disperse a large crowd of people at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, also known as Temple Mount. Israeli authorities say groups were throwing rocks at the compound after morning prayer. At least 150 people have been injured. The clashes come as Christians, Jews and Muslims prepare to celebrate Easter, Passover and Ramadan. Dozens of climate change protesters have been charged after 3 oil terminals were blocked today. Activists from Just Stop Oil blocked roads and climbed on oil tankers in Staffordshire and Essex. The group, who are linked to Extinction Rebellion, are demanding the government stops new oil and gas projects. One campaigner says the government isn't doing enough. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Stay with us. The briefing with Arlene Foster will be back in just a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, but to the point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
So welcome back to the briefing. It's 15:37. A Russian warship that was damaged by an explosion on Wednesday has sunk, Russia's defence ministry has said. Moskv, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, was being towed to port when stormy seas caused it to sink, according to the Kremlin. After saying initially that the warship was afloat late on Thursday, the Russian defence ministry announced that the Moskv had been lost. This comes as yesterday former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, nearly got it right, warned that the West could take action, or warned the West that action would be taken if Sweden or Finland decided to join NATO. And joining me now from Edinburgh is former British Army officer Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford. We'll get to NATO in a second, Stuart, but first of all, I wanted to ask you about the significance of the sinking of this ship in the Black Sea.
Good afternoon, Arlene, and thank you for having me on your programme. There's no doubt that the sinking of the Moskva, no matter which side of the story you believe, is a significant blow to the prestige and prowess of Russia's armed forces, and obviously particularly their navy. I think the consensus is that it's much more credible that it was hit by a Ukrainian missile, the Neptune missile, which is a sort of self-developed surface-to-sea missile, than it was the cause of an ammunition explosion and fire on board, which seems much less credible. But however it happened, it is a major blow for prestige, and these things resonate through populations. I'm old enough to remember when the Sheffield went down during the Falklands campaign, and that gave everyone a bit of a shock. And no doubt the same will apply with the sinking of the Moskva.
I was thinking about that myself because unfortunately I'm old enough to remember that as well. But it will have been a morale boost for the Ukrainian forces, I would imagine, given everything that has happened to them and the fact that Russian troops have pulled away from Kiev, and this now happening as well will give them a morale boost, given that the attention's now going to shift to the Donbass region.
No, absolutely. And, you know, as far as Ukraine's going, bearing in mind it's been invaded and there's huge destruction across its country, but things are going better than many people, including myself, expected them to do for the Ukrainian defenders, and much worse for the Russian army and Russian Air Force and Navy than we predicted. So it will be a morale boost for Ukraine. I think we in the West have just got to keep pressing to deliver the sort of weapons that they need to defend their territory and also eventually to take back territory which has been lost.
And if we can move on to the NATO issue now, because Finland and Sweden, before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was no conversation about them joining NATO. But now, as the Finnish PM has said herself, everything has changed as a result of that invasion, and it looks as if they're moving towards that. Moving towards it together, it has to be said. Both countries moving, it looks like, in lockstep.
Yes, I mean, it's a great paradox, isn't it, that one of the reasons why Putin attacked and invaded Ukraine was because he feared that Ukraine was getting too close to NATO, and there seems to be this paranoia that NATO is infringing more and more on Russians' borders and Russia's previous area of influence. And lo and behold, one of the results of the attack on Ukraine is that both Finland and Sweden are now very much in favour of joining NATO, or so it would appear. That very much secures NATO's left flank, as I would look at it in military terms, the northern part of the potential NATO area, particularly Finland, which has got, I think it's an 830-kilometre border with Russia, and has a very strong military. The regular army, regular forces in Finland are about 50,000, but they claim to have a reserve of up to 900,000 because of their conscription still applies there. Sweden dropped conscription, but now has reintroduced it. So that's a significant bolster to NATO on that northern flank, and one which Russia will not welcome.
Well, indeed, and we were, as you were speaking there, we were seeing footage of the former President Medvedev, who has had some pretty strong words for the West if Finland and Sweden have the temerity to join NATO. He's been talking about nuclear escalation and all sorts of things. So what do you make of that? Is that them worried?
Well, I mean, they're certainly worried about it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing that sort of thing. But I still think that this is mainly saber rattling and brinkmanship, because the one thing that Russia and Vladimir Putin cannot afford to enter is into direct confrontation with NATO, because without any shadow of a doubt, although that any sort of conflict would be awful, NATO will win, and NATO will win convincingly. And so at some point, his bluff is going to have to be called. And it's time, I think, that the West started telling Russia and Vladimir Putin what is acceptable rather than the other way around.
Indeed, and he went on to talk about the need to rebalance the situation if Finland and Sweden join NATO. Well, it looks as if Finland is slightly ahead. I did talk about lockstep between the two countries, but it looks as if Finland's slightly ahead of Sweden's process. But I think I'm right, aren't I, Stuart, that they will both join or not both join? I mean, this is something they're going to do together, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. And, well, it would appear so. I mean, one can never really sort of predict absolutely, but they seem to be in step on this one. And indeed, talk about trying to join NATO or be accepted for membership of NATO by June is really quite remarkable stuff. And it just shows how seriously they take the current situation.
Well, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and giving us your view on what's happening in Ukraine and indeed between Sweden and Finland. So Angelica's still with me. What do you make of this rush by Finland and Sweden to join NATO? These were two countries that weren't even thinking about it up until now.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and polls in Finland showing that it's a popular choice.
Yes,
they do want to join. I think your expert was right. I think at some point the bluff will be called, and them joining NATO kind of strengthens NATO as a whole and gives all that region more strength. So it's an interesting thing to happen. It will happen. It looks like it might be happening in the next few weeks.
And it's quite something, isn't it, that one of the reasons why Putin felt he had to go into Ukraine was because he didn't have that buffer zone between himself and NATO. And now, as we've heard, there's an 800-mile border between Finland and Russia, which is now going to be NATO.
Yeah, which will be NATO, which gives so much more power to NATO overall and makes it a real challenger. I think one thing I'd like to come back to remember, I think when we look at these scenes, the war that started a few weeks ago, it will almost become numb to these scenes now because we've seen them for so long, and remembering that this is a humanitarian crisis that we're seeing, and even Ukraine's prosecutor general saying that this is now a genocide and using that terminology. Just remember that we need to be continuing our awareness around what's happening for the Ukrainian people, continuing to donate, to do what we can with resources, with finances, and not just become part of the news cycle and we kind of move on, as it were.
No, you're so right, Angelica, and indeed we've covered it in this station that actually, we need to very much remember that the citizens of Ukraine are the people that are being forced to live through this terrible time. We're now going to move on to look at net zero, and the UK government is set to order more drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea in defiance of its own net zero targets, while neglecting alternative measures that experts say would provide much quicker relief from high energy bills and reduce greenhouse gas emissions instead of raising them. Ministers are expected to say in the coming weeks that the UK needs more oil and gas in the short term, including new sources of fossil fuel imports to replace the small proportion of UK oil and gas that comes from Russia, and ease pressure on prices. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Head of Policy at Net Zero Watch, Harry Wilkinson. Harry, good to see you, and thanks for coming on the show. What do you make of the latest moves by the government in relation to oil and gas?
Well, there seems to be a few small steps in a positive direction. These new licensing rounds, I think, will be a positive step. What we need to see as well, I think, is the fracking moratorium lifted, because there's a potentially even greater source of gas onshore. And one thing we did see with the energy security strategy, the government actually said that they would allow the science to be reviewed on the onshore gas shale moratorium. So that's going to take 3 months. It needs to be happening quicker than that, because we know it can be done safely because of the experience in the United States. But this is a crisis that we're seeing at the moment, which has been a long time in the making. The net zero and the decarbonisation agenda has really meant that many pension funds, institutional investors have taken a sort of a negative view on oil and gas, and so we've seen less investment in oil and gas exploration than we would have expected to see. And so we've been really unprepared for this crisis, which as countries come out of their COVID-based lockdowns, we've seen a massive surge in demand, even before we saw the Ukraine crisis add further pressure to prices. So this has all led to this situation, and the rhetoric on net zero seems to be shifting inch by inch towards a recognition that oil and gas will be needed for many, many years to come. And these new licensing rounds are a reflection of that, but we do need to go further.
Yes, I've heard some Conservative MPs talk about oil and gas as a transition now, as opposed to just stop it immediately. But I'd be interested to hear your views in relation to nuclear, because those who are against oil and gas also seem to be against nuclear. And you mentioned the energy strategy there. It talks a lot about offshore wind, about the use of hydrogen, which I think is a very good thing. But there's not so much about nuclear. Would you like to see more about nuclear in that strategy?
That's right. That is the one low carbon solution that would actually be able to properly displace oil and gas off the system, because at the moment, the drive towards renewables, towards offshore wind in particular, and that target's just been ramped up to 50 gigawatts rather than 40 gigawatts, that power needs to be backed up. So it doesn't meet our security of supply needs, because we just can't rely on it. We can't rely on the wind blowing at any one point. So nuclear is the alternative that can actually provide that reliable baseload capacity. The government clearly wants to encourage that. They've introduced a new regulated asset-based model, which there's a new bill coming through Parliament, which is to allow that model to bring forward new nuclear power stations. I certainly hope that will be successful. We want to make sure that consumers are protected here, because in the past, what's been holding nuclear power back to a large extent is concerns around the cost. So we need the right financing model to bring forward low-cost nuclear power stations. And I think the kind of model that you need to do that is a model that's based off of replicating a plan for nuclear power stations that works, rather than having to redesign a nuclear power station afresh each time. So if we can just find a model that works and keep repeating that, then we can get the costs down for nuclear and have a low carbon grid that's based on
Well, Harry, just before I let you go, I wanted to ask you about storage, because if we are looking at more offshore wind, surely one of the things that we should be concentrating on, I would argue we should have been looking at this quite some time ago, is storage. what role has storage in relation to our strategy moving forward? Because, of course, as you and I know, if the wind blows too much, actually people get paid to turn off the wind and, instead of actually storing what has been generated.
That's right. We're in a perverse situation now where we spend huge amounts backing up wind for when it doesn't blow, and then huge amounts again on top of that in terms of paying wind turbines to switch off when there's too much wind. And then, of course, we subsidise most of the wind turbines on top of that again. So it's a hugely generous subsidy regime that exists for onshore wind. It's been part of what's contributed to the high prices we're seeing in electricity right now. And so storage is actually the way that renewables can really fix our energy needs in the future. It's not there yet. But all of the country's electricity storage capacity at the moment could only power the country for a very short period of time, perhaps only hours, if that. So the storage technology needs to come forward a lot.
Yeah.
And actually one way to do that is to actually incentivize the wind turbine, the electricity generators to actually be responsible for balancing the grid and backing up their own power supply. And then you would see these wind generators who previously could just sort of offload that cost of backup onto the consumer, not be able to do that anymore. And when they had a financial incentive to drive that storage, then we might see some improvements in that area as well.
Thanks, Harry. Thank you so much for coming on and giving us your views in relation to the energy strategy. But moving on quickly now, Tesla boss Elon Musk has admitted he is not sure his takeover bid for social media firm Twitter will be successful. He made the comments at a conference just hours after revealing that he had offered to buy the company for $54.20 a share, valuing the firm at $43 billion. Also on Thursday, Twitter's chief executive told employees that the company was evaluating the approach. Joining me now to discuss this is Professor Sid Mohaseb. I'm sorry, Sid, that we don't have more time, but quickly give us an update in relation to what Elon Musk is up to.
Clearly Elon is a smart man with a very strategic mind. His move, first of all, to take about 9.2% of the company Twitter gave him a pretty good hold on the company. He's just under 10%, which means that if he wants to sell the shares, there's no really limitations from an SEC perspective and so forth. His move about trying to buy the company obviously lifted the stock price quite a bit, and I don't believe that they would accept it for a couple of reasons. One is I think it would be felt that it would be intrusive. Second is that he currently does not have the cash offer to the cash to actually do the transaction, because this was a cash offer. He either has to sell his stock in Tesla, which would impact that negatively, or he has to go under quite a bit of leverage. But regardless, if the bid is not accepted, which is likely, particularly the Saudi shareholders who have about 5% have outright rejected that. If the move is not going to give him that control or the ability to buy, it opens up a wonderful opportunity, because the stock is already going up, and he would be able to make more money, as well as it would open up Twitter for other tech companies to look at it as a target.
I mean, some people see Elon Musk as eccentric, others will see him as visionary. Some even think of him as a bit of a supervillain. How do you think he sits within the world order at present?
Well, again, he is a very smart and a great entrepreneur and great thinker. But I think it was a British man who first said absolute power corrupts absolutely. He is bordering becoming a supervillain in one sense, controlling the skies. He has, from FCC, ability to put thousands and thousands of satellites and control communications through internet. I mean, there are good things. His intentions are noble, but one could think that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He has good intentions about the environmental issues with electric cars and so forth. He has good intentions in providing internet and access to almost over 3 billion people who don't have it. He has good intentions with his Neuralink company that is trying to control the mind and cure some diseases from that perspective. But it's just too much responsibility for one man. And it's not about the money that he makes. It's about us. It's about how we see our future in control of one man, as strong and as smart as he might be.
Well, Professor Sid Mohasba, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your view around a man who is very controversial, but at the end of the day is also very rich and has a lot of power. So I'm sorry I haven't got time to go back to Angelica about all of that, but thank you so much for joining me this afternoon and giving us your briefing on what's been going on. But you've been watching the briefing this afternoon with me, Arlene Foster. The show is back every Friday from 3 p.m. and up next, it's Nana. Thanks for listening and watching.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking dry for many with some sunshine, but cloudier in the west. Let's take a look at the details. Skies are likely to be cloudy across parts of Devon and Cornwall this afternoon, with some drizzle and sea fog in the west. Further east, it'll be brighter with some warm, sunny spells. The brightness extends into southeast England, where there'll be plenty of sunny spells this afternoon, feeling warm in the sunshine with a high of 23 Celsius in London today. It's a cloudier picture for much of Wales, with some patchy drizzle over the hills. The sunshine could break through at times in the east, where it'll feel warm.